On a spring night in 1993, a man walked into a Chase Manhattan branch in Brooklyn, robbed it, and then, as police surrounded the building, took hostages and barricaded himself inside. The FBI's hostage negotiators arrived, and for hours, everything the textbooks had taught them about rational bargaining, about splitting the difference, meeting in the middle, trading concession for concession, simply failed to work, because the man on the other end of the phone was not behaving like a rational actor calculating his best interest. He was behaving like a frightened, cornered human being. Chris Voss was one of the negotiators who eventually talked that standoff to a peaceful end, and the experience became the seed of an argument he would spend the next 20 years refining, first inside the FBI's crisis negotiation unit, and later teaching to business executives, students, and anyone willing to listen. The argument is blunt, and it cuts directly against how most people are taught to negotiate. Splitting the difference is not fairness. It is failure dressed up as compromise, and the entire model of negotiation built on rational calculation misunderstands what is actually happening at the table, because human decisions under pressure are driven far more by emotion, trust, and the felt experience of being understood than by careful weighing of logical options. Voss's core claim is that effective negotiation is not primarily about arguments or leverage. It is about accurately identifying and working with the emotional reality of the person across from you, using specific, learnable techniques, most of them drawn directly from hostage work, where the stakes made vague or approximate methods unaffordable. He is explicit that this represents a genuine break from the negotiation orthodoxy that dominated business schools for decades, built largely around game theory, and the assumption that both parties are rational actors seeking to maximize measurable gain. Voss argues that assumption quietly fails even in ordinary business contexts, not just extreme ones, because the people sitting across the table are never purely rational. They are tired, anxious about how a decision will be judged by others, protective of their own status, and reacting as much to how a proposal is delivered as to what it actually contains. A framework built entirely around logical self-interest, he argues, is solving for a version of human behavior that rarely shows up in the room. In this video, I want to walk through the actual mechanics of how he says this works, not just the well-known slogans that have circulated widely since the book's release, but the reasoning underneath each technique, and where, honestly, the claims hold up better in some contexts than others. Stay with me. Tactical empathy. Voss opens his framework with a term borrowed loosely from psychology but sharpened for negotiation specifically. Tactical empathy is not sympathy, and it is not agreement. It is the deliberate, disciplined act of understanding and articulating the other person's perspective and feelings out loud before attempting to move the conversation anywhere. The specific claim is counterintuitive. Most negotiators are trained to build their own case first, assuming that a strong argument, delivered clearly, is what moves a negotiation forward. Voss argues the opposite sequence works better. Until the other person feels genuinely heard and understood, they are not psychologically available to actually process your argument at all, no matter how well constructed it is. Their attention is consumed by the unmet need to be understood, and any case you make before addressing that need is, in practice, largely wasted. The mechanism he describes is not about pretending to care. It requires accurately nomming what the other side is likely feeling, specifically enough that they recognize themselves in the description. Get it wrong, and the attempt backfires, sounding hollow or manipulative. Get it right, and something shifts almost immediately, because being accurately understood is rare enough that it changes how defensive a person needs to remain. Voss distinguishes this sharply from what he calls positive thinking, the common advice to simply approach negotiations with optimism and goodwill. Tactical empathy is not an attitude. It is closer to a discipline of accurate observation, requiring the negotiator to set aside their own agenda long enough to genuinely track what the other person is experiencing, moment to moment, and only then decide how to respond to it. He argues this is considerably harder than it sounds precisely, because most people, under the pressure of a negotiation, default to rehearsing their own next argument rather than actually listening to what is happening across the table. Mirroring. The simplest technique Voss teaches, and the one most immediately usable, is mirroring, repeating back the last few words the other person said, framed as a question. Someone says the price is too high for their budget this quarter. You repeat, quarter. The specific mechanism is that this small repetition, almost effortless to produce, reliably prompts the other person to keep talking, elaborating on what they just said without feeling interrogated. Voss draws this directly from research on how mirroring builds rapport at a largely unconscious level, and from his own field experience noticing that hostage takers, when mirrored rather than argued with, consistently kept disclosing more information, often more than a direct question would have extracted. This matters practically because information is the actual currency of negotiation. The side that understands the other's actual constraints, priorities, and fears is the side capable of proposing a solution that genuinely works for both parties, rather than guessing. Mirroring is, in Voss's telling, simply the lowest effort, highest yield way to keep that information flowing without triggering the guardedness that direct questioning often produces. He is specific about how little effort the technique requires to work, which he treats as part of its value. Unlike more advanced techniques that take real practice to deploy naturally, mirroring can be used almost immediately, in the middle of a sentence, without breaking the flow of conversation or signaling to the other person that a technique is being used at all. Voss recounts using it in hostage calls specifically because it bought time to think without ever going silent, keeping the other side talking, and therefore keeping the situation from escalating, while the negotiator worked out what to say next. Labeling. Where mirroring repeats words, labeling names emotions directly. Voss teaches a specific verbal formula, opening with a phrase like it seems like or it sounds like, followed by a guess at the emotion underneath what the other person just said, without ever using the word I, which he argues shifts the statement's focus away from your own perspective and keeps it centered on theirs. The specific insight is that nomming an emotion out loud tends to diffuse its intensity. Voss draws on research suggesting that putting feelings into words engages a different part of the brain than simply experiencing them, and that this labeling process measurably reduces the emotional charge of a difficult moment, whether the label is fully accurate or not. A negotiator who says, "It sounds like this deadline is putting real pressure on you," is not flattering the other side. They are giving the emotion in the room a name, which Voss argues makes it easier for both people to move past reacting to it and toward actually addressing it. He is specific about tone here as well. Labels work best delivered slowly, almost tentatively, leaving space afterward for the other person to correct or confirm rather than stated as a confident diagnosis, which risks sounding presumptuous rather than perceptive. Voss also uses labeling defensively, a use case he treats as just as important as its offensive applications. Nomming a negative perception before the other side raises it themselves, saying something like, "It probably looks like we are not taking this seriously," can diffuse an objection before it fully forms, because voicing the criticism yourself removes much of its force. He calls this an accusation audit, deliberately listing every negative thing the other side might be thinking, out loud, early in the conversation, on the theory that an accusation spoken preemptively lands with far less weight than one the other person has been building up in silence. Calibrated questions. Voss argues that closed, yes or no questions frequently corner people, triggering defensiveness rather than cooperation. His alternative is what he calls calibrated questions, typically beginning with how or what, designed to hand the other side the feeling of control while quietly steering them towards solving your problem for you. The specific example he returns to repeatedly is a question like, "How am I supposed to do that?" delivered not as a complaint but as a genuine, almost helpless request for guidance. The effect, he argues, is that the other person is drawn into problem-solving on your behalf, often generating concessions or solutions they would have resisted if you had simply demanded them directly. The mechanism behind this is subtle but specific. A demand invites resistance because it positions the two sides as adversaries with opposing goals. A calibrated question invites collaboration because it frames the other person as the expert being consulted, which tends to produce more genuine, durable buy-in than a concession extracted through pressure, since people are considerably more committed to solutions they feel they arrived at themselves. Voss also uses calibrated questions as a substitute for direct refusal, a technique he considers particularly useful when a demand needs to be declined without triggering open conflict. Rather than saying no to an unreasonable request, he suggests responding with a question like, "How am I supposed to agree to that?" which shifts the burden of solving the problem back onto the person who made the request, without ever requiring an outright confrontation. This keeps the conversation moving forward rather than stalling on a flat refusal, while still communicating clearly that the current terms are not acceptable. The power of no. Most negotiation training treats getting to yes as the goal, a framing Voss argues is exactly backward. He notes that people are far more comfortable and far more honest when given the freedom to say no, because no feels like safety, a boundary they still control, while yes often feels like exposure, a commitment they may not be ready to make. His specific technique is deliberately engineering questions that make no the comfortable answer, such as asking whether a plan is a bad idea rather than asking whether someone agrees to it. Counterintuitively, he argues this produces faster, more honest engagement than pushing directly for agreement, because it removes the defensive posture a demand for yes typically triggers, and once someone feels safe enough to say no, they tend to become considerably more forthcoming about what would actually change their answer. He extends this into a specific caution about a different kind of yes, what he calls a counterfeit yes, agreement offered simply to end an uncomfortable conversation rather than genuine commitment. This kind of yes, Voss warns, tends to unravel later, once the other person is no longer under direct social pressure to maintain it. A well-earned no, by contrast, is often a more reliable foundation to build from, because it reflects an actual position rather than a temporary accommodation made to escape the discomfort of the moment. The "that's right" moment. Voss identifies a specific verbal signal he treats as the clearest marker that a negotiation has genuinely shifted. When a person responds to a summary of their position with "that's right," rather than the more common "you're right," something different has happened. "You're right" is frequently a dismissal, a way of ending a conversation the other person has grown tired of. "That's right" signals genuine recognition, a feeling of having been accurately understood, and Voss argues it reliably precedes real, durable movement in a negotiation far more than any argument or pressure tactic does. The practical technique for reaching that moment is what he calls a summary, restating the other person's position, priorities, and concerns back to them so completely and accurately that they have nothing left to correct. This is not the same as simply repeating their words. It requires genuinely synthesizing what they have said into an account they recognize as their own, which is precisely why it is harder to do well than it sounds, and why Voss treats it as one of the more advanced skills in his entire framework. He is careful to note what a "that's right" moment does not guarantee. It signals that the emotional and factual picture has been accurately understood, not that agreement or concession automatically follows. Voss treats it as a necessary condition for genuine movement rather than a sufficient one, a foundation that has to be built before any specific proposal is likely to land, rather than a closing technique in itself. Extreme anchors and the Ackerman model. On the more tactical, numbers-driven side of negotiation, Voss lays out a specific bargaining sequence he calls the Ackerman model, developed originally for hostage ransom negotiations and later adapted for business use. It involves setting an extreme initial anchor, deliberately far from your actual target, then making a sequence of concessions that shrink in size as the negotiation progresses, with the final offers landing on unusual, non-round numbers rather than clean figures. The specific reasoning behind the non-round numbers is worth nomming directly. Voss argues that a precise, seemingly calculated figure, such as a specific unrounded number rather than a tidy estimate, reads as more carefully considered and less arbitrary, making the other side more likely to treat it as a genuine final position rather than an opening move still open to further reduction. The shrinking concession pattern serves a similar signaling function, silently communicating that the room for further movement is closing, without needing to state that outright. Voss pairs this tactical framework with a broader concept he calls black swans, a term borrowed loosely to describe unknown pieces of information, held by the other side, that would meaningfully change the negotiation if uncovered. He argues that most negotiators focus almost entirely on the leverage and information they already possess, while the real breakthroughs, in his own hostage cases especially, tended to come from information nobody at the table initially knew was relevant. His specific recommendation is treating every negotiation as though at least one such black swan is present, and deliberately using the earlier listening techniques, mirroring, labeling, calibrated questions, as tools for surfacing it rather than simply advancing your own position. Now let us be honest about this book. Voss writes with genuine narrative tension, and the hostage negotiation stories that anchor each chapter make the book considerably more vivid and memorable than most negotiation manuals. That narrative strength is also, on close inspection, part of where the book is weakest as evidence. The specific techniques are drawn overwhelmingly from a narrow, extreme context, life-or-death hostage situations involving individuals often in acute psychological crisis. And Voss extrapolates from that context to ordinary business negotiations, salary discussions, and everyday disputes with considerably more confidence than the underlying evidence strictly supports. What reliably works when talking down an armed, frightened person does not automatically transfer with the same reliability to negotiating a vendor contract or a job offer, and the book offers comparatively little in the way of controlled research, specifically testing these techniques outside the hostage context Voss knows best. This gap matters more in some chapters than others. Techniques like mirroring and labeling rest on reasonably well-established psychological groundwork about rapport and emotional regulation, and translate fairly plausibly into everyday settings. The more elaborate tactical sequences, the extreme anchor and shrinking concession pattern in particular, rest much more heavily on Voss's personal track record and far less on independent testing, meaning a reader adopting them wholesale in a business context is, in effect, trusting anecdote over evidence to a greater degree than the book's confident tone tends to signal. There is also a fair critique regarding one specific claim the book repeats, the well-known statistic that communication is roughly 7% words, 38% tone, and 55% body language. This figure, widely cited across popular negotiation and communication books, traces back to narrow, decades-old research on emotional expression that its own original author has repeatedly cautioned against generalizing this broadly, and its continued repetition in Voss's book reflects a wider pattern in the genre of treating a catchy, oversimplified statistic as settled science. Finally, some readers have raised a legitimate ethical question about a handful of the techniques, particularly the more engineered uses of calibrated questions and manufactured urgency, which can shade, in less careful hands, from persuasion into manipulation, extracting agreement through psychological pressure rather than genuinely aligned interests. Voss generally frames his techniques as tools for finding mutually workable outcomes rather than exploiting the other side. But the line between the two, in practice, depends considerably more on the user's intent than the techniques themselves guarantee. None of this erases the book's real value. The core insight, that emotion, not logic, drives most real-world negotiation, and that specific, learnable language can address that emotional layer directly, is well supported by the author's extensive direct experience, even where the broader research base is thinner than the book's confident tone might suggest. So what do you actually take from this? The most immediately useful technique is also the simplest. In your next difficult conversation, resist the urge to state your case first. Try naming what the other person is likely feeling out loud before you say anything about your own position, and notice what changes in how willing they are to actually listen afterward. This single shift, small as it sounds, tends to be the hardest one to actually practice consistently, precisely because it requires setting aside your own urgency at the exact moment urgency feels most justified. Voss argues this is also why so few negotiators do it well. It is simple to understand and genuinely difficult to execute under real pressure, which is exactly the gap deliberate practice is meant to close. The second useful shift is toward questions over demands. Instead of asking someone to agree with you, ask them how they would solve the problem you are both facing. The specific solution they propose may end up looking remarkably similar to what you wanted in the first place, but arrived at this way, it tends to stick considerably better than the same outcome imposed directly. The third useful shift is learning to listen for the difference between a real yes and a counterfeit one, and to treat a comfortable, honest no as progress rather than failure. A negotiation that moves forward on a foundation of genuine agreement, even a smaller one, tends to hold up far better over time than one that moved forward quickly on agreement nobody actually meant. The fourth thing is simply this. A negotiation that ends in a clean 50-50 split is not usually evidence that both sides were treated fairly. It is often evidence that neither side did the work of understanding what the other actually needed, and settled for the laziest available answer instead. The harder, more effective path is slower, requires genuinely listening first, and rarely lands on a number that looks tidy on paper, which is precisely why so few people are willing to do it properly. Thanks for watching all the way through. The best deals were never split down the middle. They were built by whoever bothered to actually understand the other side of the table first.